thousands of years of human drama played out on the northwest fringe of Europe. One of the oldest nations in the world.
Sex, rape, violence, murder, conspiracy, it's all there.
One Burns is worth 1,000 Bannockburns.
When you hear that gunfire, that's the sound of Britain and Scotland being dragged kicking and screaming into the modern era.
There's so much history here, it's impossible to know it all. But what are the essentials?
William Wallace.
How about Bonnie Prince Charlie?
The joining of England and Scotland is Great Britain.
Robert Burns is international. Everybody knows about Robert Burns.
We asked Scots from all walks of life what they think shaped the nation. Scotland's essential history. Was it Robert Burns, or defeating the English at Bannockburn? Was it scientists like James Clerk Maxwell, or men of the cloth like John Knox, inventors like James Watt, or warriors like William Wallace? In this film, we'll reveal the people, events and ideas that today's Scots believe made Scotland, Scotland. And we'll have our top historians bringing the stories to life. This bridge at Coldstream spans the River Tweed. On this bank, England. On the far side, Scotland. But it could all have been so different. Scotland might just have been an English province if it wasn't for the wars of independence.
The Wars of Independence, put simply, is when England, under Edward I, attempted to take over Scotland, and the Scots put up huge resistance. First under people like William Wallace, and then under their king, Robert Bruce. Be no Scotland in the way that we know it today if it wasn't for the wars, because the Scots managed to stop being taken over and becoming a province of England, so that's very fundamental. We have, of course, two of the greatest heroes of Scottish history across the board in the same period, Wallace and Bruce, and whether we like it or not, we have international recognition now today because of Braveheart, because that story of a small nation fighting for its independence against a larger aggressor is a story that transcends time and place and has put Scotland on the international map. Wallace is easy, he's black and white, he was good, great, if you're Scottish anyway. Bruce is more ambivalent because there's no doubting his family's ambition. The number one priority for the Bruces is the throne of Scotland, and they will do almost anything, including murder, to get it. But he proved the man to save Scotland as well, and in that is his greatness. He was the man who could do it. It didn't matter that he really, in some ways, didn't have a right to sit on the throne of Scotland. He had expelled the English and won the Civil War, and as a result Scotland was still absolutely intact and in good state when he died in 1329. Bannockburn is obviously a key and seminal moment in Scottish history. The sense that this small nation had beaten off one of the greatest medieval armies of all time, I think was profoundly important in shaping Scottish identity.
Here in Arbroath, they've got strong views about what's important in Scottish history.
The Declaration of Arbroath, the Declaration of Independence, what a document.
It was the Declaration of Scottish Independence. It was signed at the Abbey. I can't remember the year, it was in the 1300s. That's when it was signed, and it's part of Scottish heritage. And I'm Scottish, I'm not British.
Professor Ted Cowan tells us why this 14th century letter still matters today.
The Declaration of Arbroath was a letter sent by the nobility, the baronage and the community of the realm of Scotland to the Pope in 1320, urging him to bring pressure to bear upon the English king to recognise the legitimacy of Robert Bruce's claim to be King of Scots. Robert Bruce had made his bid for the kingship as long ago as 1306, won a great victory at Bannockburn, but it made no difference. So now the time was to revert to some sort of diplomatic activity. The importance of this document lies in 2 clauses. The document actually states, if Robert Bruce should ever submit us or our kingdom to the King of England or the English, we will remove him and set up another better able to govern us in his place. This is the first articulation in Europe, in my view, of the idea of the contractual theory of monarchy, or if you prefer, the sovereignty of the people. The king is elected by his subjects, and so the king can be deposed by his subjects, and that's crucially important because that lies at the basis of all modern constitutionalism, that idea. The second clause, which immediately follows that one, is the one that says, famously, for as long as 100 of us remain alive, we shall never surrender. It is not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom alone, which no honest person will lose, but with life itself. The Declaration is an important document in its own right at the time when it was composed in 1320. But since then, over time, it has taken on a new importance. It's taken on almost an assumption that I believe most Scots share. Kings or any other officials cannot be allowed to get out there on their own. They must be brought to book if they seem to be stepping out of line. And the other thing is the idea that becomes very important in Scottish history, right through the Reformation, the Covenanting Revolution, the poetry of Robert Burns, the Enlightenment, and into the origins of the Labour Party and all the rest of it, and that is the whole issue of personal freedom. Freedom is the important thing. Freedom is what makes us who we are individually, and it's freedom that makes us who we are as a nation.
Scotland's King James IV famously lost the Battle of Flodden here in September 1513 and got himself killed in the process, but he left a great legacy. Under him and his son James V, Scotland ceased to be a backwater and joined Renaissance Europe.
The period of the Renaissance court is the late 15th century to the early 16th century. It's the courts of James IV and James V. And this is really when Scotland emerges from being the provincial backwater to culturally fashionable as were the other courts of Europe. James IV had a range of interests and passions. He was a linguist, he was a scholar, he was a scientist, he was a warrior, he was a good leader, he was a patron of the arts in particular. The building that we're entering now is the Great Hall at Stirling Castle. Now, this was built at the turn of the 16th century, around about 1503, by James IV. This was the grandest hall of its time in Scotland and really speaks of the architectural achievement of James IV's reign. James IV's major cultural achievements are the ones that have a lasting impact on Scotland today. In particular, he was the first European monarch to have a law which specified that all sons of barons and freeholders should have a rudimentary level of education. He also founded the Royal College of Surgeons in 1506, and finally he issued the patent in 1507 for the first printing press in Scotland. One of the remarkable things about James V is that he was heavily influenced by French Renaissance architecture, and we see evidence of that throughout Scotland. The reigns of James IV and James V really are the first time where the Kingdom of Scotland has been brought to the fore in European politics and culture. This is the emergence of Scotland. It's no longer the cultural backwater that it was. This is Scotland engaging with what's happening in Europe in a way that it hadn't done before.
Mary Queen of Scots is famous throughout the world, but according to historian Jenny Wormald, Mary is of less interest to historians than she is to romantic novelists.
Why do people read the novels of Barbara Cartland? And Mary's even better than novels like that. Sex, rape, violence, murder, conspiracy, it's all there. She's good for the tourist industry.
Jenny Wormald argues that Mary's era is vital because it saw the Reformation.
What was the Reformation? One of the most momentous events in the history of Western Europe, when in the 16th century Christendom fell apart, and in every kingdom in Western Europe there were now more churches than simply the Catholic Church. How did Protestantism differ from Catholicism? It's a much more austere religion. There may be something about the very fact of where Scotland is that makes this tough, austere religion attractive. It's something which has had a huge effect on Scottish self-awareness. I think that the Scots did learn from the Reformation a sense of the importance of education. The first book of discipline, drawn up in 1560, has got the most moving vision of universal education. And by 1700, there was a school in every lowland parish. Why is this small country, small and impoverished country, a country with such a distinguished educational record? Because that's what the Reformation inculcated into people, the importance of education, the importance of literacy. The Reformation. It's colossal.
For centuries, Scotland fought England for its independence. But in this building in 1707, we Scots voted to unite with England. So, why the U-turn?
We are in Parliament Hall, and on the 16th of January 1707, this is the place where members of the Scottish Parliament voted themselves out of existence. It was the most important event in Scottish history because it brought Scottish independence to an end. From 1707, Scotland becomes part of the British state, and the Union lays the template for Scotland's involvement with Britain right up to the present day. This is at the time of the War of Spanish Succession. Queen Anne thought that the only effective way to secure England's northern border, to secure the Hanoverian succession, was effectively to incorporate the Scottish Parliament into the English Parliament. In other words, you get rid of the Scottish Parliament. So, at the end of the day, no matter what the Scots had wanted, no matter what the Scots negotiated, the fundamental reason for the Union was that England wanted the Union, England would have the Union, and England was prepared to use military force if diplomacy failed. There is great hostility, popular hostility to the Union in 1707. There's riots in Glasgow and Edinburgh, they continue for days. The articles are burnt publicly in Stirling and in Dumfries, so there is general opposition. Although the Union brings Scottish independence to an end in 1707, what it does is it gives the Scots access to the British state and the British Empire. And the Scots take full advantage of that. Scots wholeheartedly take part in the British imperial project. Scotland takes part in the Industrial Revolution. Scotland becomes part of the world's first global superpower. One of the features of the Union of 1707 is it is as much today a political question as a historical question. However, no matter what your view on the Union, one thing that cannot be denied is the massive significance that it has had on the development of the nation for the last 300 years.
From wars of independence waged against England to a treaty of union with England, Scotland's come a long way in 4 centuries. Up next, the Jacobite rebellions and how the last pitched battle fought on British soil ended an era in Scottish history. To discover the must-knows of Scottish history, we asked Scots to nominate the top people, events and ideas from their past. In this programme, historians reveal the people's essential history of Scotland.
I think the most important part of Scottish history is the birth of Robbie Burns.
James Watt.
The Scottish Enlightenment.
Culloden's a sore one.
The Old Pretender, the man who might have been Scotland's King James VIII, fled from here, Montrose, to France in 1716. His insurrection against the British government had been crushed, but the Jacobite cause was not yet lost.
They say the next big thing is here, that the revolution's near. But to me it seems quite clear that it's all just a little bit of history repeating.
Bonnie Prince Charlie was Charles Edward Stuart, and at the time of the Battle of Culloden he was 25 years old. He'd gone into the family business in a big way, and what he desperately wanted to do was to put his father, who was known as the Old Pretender, who was James II's son, onto the throne. And he would go to any lengths to do that. And at the end of 1745, 1746, that length consisted of a lot of good men dying in his name. We're on the battlefield at Culloden, and we're stood just about where the government line, the Redcoats, the British Army, was standing, facing the Jacobite army, which was a good distance away, maybe 700 metres off in that direction. And after a cannonade, because both sides had cannons, after they'd exchanged fire, the Jacobites charged, and the Jacobites got this far, and it's here that most of the killing of the battle happened. And for 15 minutes on that day or thereabouts, this was absolute hell on earth. The Jacobite risings are incredibly important to us today. And the defeat of the Jacobites closed the back door to Britain to the French. It increased the British Army's numbers because a lot of the Jacobites, especially the Highlanders, joined the British Army and they became an elite force, and they did a lot of fighting on behalf of Britain overseas. So what you've got is the foundation stones of the British Empire being set in place. You've also got the economic foundation which this peace brings, which allows things like the intellectual revolution, the Enlightenment. So you've got this incredible birth and flowering after this. What you're really hearing on this battlefield on the 16th of April 1746, when you hear that gunfire, that's the sound of Britain and Scotland being dragged kicking and screaming into the modern era.
The modern age of the 18th and 19th centuries was an age of revolutionary ideas, many of them political. In Scotland, radicals like Thomas Muir, commemorated on this Edinburgh monument, fought for greater freedom and rights for ordinary folk. Muir was transported to Botany Bay for sedition. In 1820, working-class discontent boiled over into a doomed and tragic rebellion, but the rebellion provided martyrs and inspiration.
We're in Sighthill Cemetery to the northeast of Glasgow, at the National Monument, which you can see over my shoulder here, to the martyrs of the 1820 Radical Rising. This was an attempt to overthrow the government of the day and to enforce the power of citizenship, annual parliaments, universal suffrage, and even at its furthest stretch, the independence of Scotland. They were able to call out over 40,000 workers right across the board: calico printers, weavers, powerloom tenters, spinners. This just totally immobilised industry in the west of Scotland and terrified the powers that be in a way that they'd never been afraid of the earlier political movements, because this affected them in their pockets where it really counted. They were hit by a force on an open moor at Bonnymuir, near the present-day Bonny Bridge, and really chopped down pretty quickly. They were taken prisoners to Stirling Castle. Wilson of Straven was a real target, and the government wanted to badly make an example of him. So he was hanged publicly in front of the High Court in Glasgow Green, and then in a very cruel ceremony beheaded, and his head presented to the crowd as this is the head of a traitor. This massive crowd that filled the green, shouting back, "This man has been murdered, this man is a martyr for our liberties," and so forth. So, very powerful scene. Scottish radicalism, it's a taboo subject. It's been taboo because it affects the political lives of every man, woman and really child in Scotland. It's about the basic democratic rights that we've won over 200 years and which we could all very easily lose.
The telephone, faxes, television, tarmac roads and the tires to drive on them, the bicycle, all invented by Scots. But leading the pack of inventors who shaped Scotland's essential history is James Watt.
James Watt's incredibly important because he's involved in everything that makes Scotland famous in the 19th century. He's involved in every facet of industry that he touches. Initially, he's in a very important circle in the 1750s in Glasgow University where real innovations are being made in chemical and mechanical engineering. He creates the James Watt steam engine, and he's also involved in all the other industries of the time, in mining, in milling. Really, everything he touches, he improves. This is the Bolton and Watt beam engine, and it was created for the Barclay and Perkins Brewery in 1786. It's the second oldest steam engine in the world. Steam put Scotland on the map. Through railways and steamships, Scotland gets an international reputation. It gets a reputation for engineering. And Watt is the start of that industry. He's the beginning of starting that tradition in Scottish life. So really he had an incredible impact on the next 200 years of Scottish industry, and one that's still felt today. The unit of electricity, the watt, is named after James Watt.
Scots didn't just invent things, they invented ideas. In the 18th century, the coffee houses and drinking dens here off Edinburgh's High Street hosted an extraordinary meeting of creative minds. It was the age of enlightenment.
Tell me that you'll open your eyes.
This is the site of the toll booth in the very heart of old Edinburgh, the city that became for about 50 years in the 18th century the ideas capital of the world, in the blazing era that we know as the Scottish Enlightenment. It was a time for philosophers and thinkers, for writers and scientists, for poets and architects, and the whole of Europe looked to this place. An English scientist came here to this very spot and said you wouldn't have to stand here for long to be able to shake 50 men of genius by the hand.
Tell me that you'll open your eyes.
This is the grave of Adam Smith in Canongate Kirkyard, one of the dazzling figures of the Enlightenment, who began to understand how the world of commerce and individual enterprise and ambition were bound to mould society, and who in his book, The Wealth of Nations, established ideas and ways of thinking about the world that still seem fresh and original and are the crux of the big economic arguments to this very day. He was one of the great men of the Enlightenment. And not far from here, on a hillside just over there lies another.
Tell me that you'll open your eyes.
David Hume is buried here, a philosopher king of the 18th century whose ideas were exported from Edinburgh to the whole of Europe and America and became intellectual ballast for generations of political thinkers and writers. In his description of the way that reason, which was the obsession of his era, was intertwined with freedom, with human consciousness, he was really a philosopher for an age yet to come, of revolution, of industrialization, of democracy. And in his rational and skeptical observations of human beings and their societies, he was Georgian Edinburgh's most modern thinker.
Tell me that you'll open your eyes.
Scotland never reached such a pitch of achievement in its intellect and culture as it did in the Enlightenment.
Behind me is a monument to one of the best known and best loved Scots of all time. No prizes for guessing. Robert Burns.
Scotland, I think, is unique among nations in that it takes its most notable identity from a poet, Robert Burns. And this is partly, of course, because he came to mean so much, not simply to Scotland, but to all the world. The world learns sentiments such as "a man's a man for all that." He is, in fact, preeminently the man who found poetry in the drawing room where it was dying of anemia, pernicious anemia. And he took it by the scruff of the neck and hurled it into the plough field. And so you get the overturning of the mouse's nest by the plough, and we sleek it curran till as measty. Oh, what a panics and thy breasty. Thou need not start to was a hasty. With bricker and brattle I would be loath to run and chase thee. With murder and battle I'm truly sorry. Man's dominion hath broken nature's social union, and justifies that ill opinion that makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal. In other words, poetry is about the way you live. It is about the way of kind of person you are. It is about what you see and you meet. It's not something delicate for an appropriate occasion, drained of anything like humanity, or anything except the genteelest of genteel manners, which Burns, God bless him, was never very good at. Burns looked at the revolutionary moment sweeping the world, and saw there a great new dawn, which, yes, he translated into his poetry in so many ways. A poem like "A Man's a Man for All That" makes you understand what the age of the democratic revolution was about. Burns, of course, was a nationalist in a great, rich cultural form. He celebrated past triumphs, which included past battles. The very obvious one was Scots wha hae wi Wallace bled, the march being sung by Bruce's troops on the way to their victory at Bannockburn. But a nationalism which is simply thinking of itself as something where they killed a number of people successfully is not nearly as much worth having as a celebration of its past, its future, and above all its present in great poetry. One Burns is worth 1,000 Bannockburns.
Scotland's history. What do you have to know Scotland? In this programme, historians reveal the essentials of Scottish history, as nominated by Scots themselves.
I think probably the Highland clearances.
Perhaps Rob Roy.
I think it's trade and immigration.
The big event for me is because I've searched into my family name, Shaw, is the Battle of, what is it? Gosh, we've just read it on that tea towel back there.
The Highland clearances are still remembered as one of the great tragedies of Scotland's history. It began when 18th century landlords evicted tenants from the Highlands to make way for more profitable flocks of sheep.
The Highlands of Scotland are a wilderness, but they're not a natural wilderness. They're a man-made wilderness. You could call it a ruined landscape, you could call it an ecological disaster. You could even call it a scar on the conscience of the nation. Highlanders were sent by the clearances all over the world. Now, for Scotland as a whole, well, they're a catastrophe. They're a catastrophe for our country's culture, for our economy, and as you can see, for its environment as well. Well, we're here on the south side of the Ross of Mull, and Shiaba. It's a beautiful village, some of the best agricultural land in the whole of Mull here. But there are no people. Before 1847, generations of people lived here. But just on one day, in 1847, the entire village was evicted. We don't know where most of them went. They vanished. The clearances really are a warning to us all. We can't just go anywhere we want and impose our ideas on other people and think that we're going to get thanked for it. That, again, is what the Highland clearances is all about.
In the 18th and 19th centuries, thousands of Scottish merchants, explorers, engineers, missionaries and emigrants set out on adventures that would make the British Empire the Scottish Empire.
Scottish emigrants left Scotland for two reasons. There was a push factor and a pull factor. We actually had a surplus of population. The other thing was that we had a surplus of an educated population, because Scottish schools and universities in the 19th century were very advanced for their time. So these, coming from a poor country and with excellent technical and other qualifications, were really ideal human raw material to go out into the empire. There was a danger in Scottish history in the earlier centuries that Scotland was going to be a closed, inward-looking kind of society. It was a very poor country. It had a pretty fanatical religion. Its only land border was with its greatest enemy. But the empire was really a liberation for Scotland. I'm absolutely sure that the empire has made Scotland better than it otherwise would have been, and that our impact on the world through the empire has been all the greater.
Virginia Street in Glasgow, named in tribute to Scotland's tobacco lords who built fortunes on the weed. Nowadays, we know all about the dangers of tobacco. All but forgotten is the other vital ingredient in this trade: slavery.
The Scots really became involved in the slave trade and the running of the plantations in the British colonies after the Treaty of Union in 1707, and within the space of 50 or 60 years, the Scots were really getting themselves heavily involved in both running the plantations and benefiting from the trade and the exports that came out of those plantations in the colonies. A lot of the people who had made themselves incredibly wealthy demonstrated their wealth by building great mansions, building estates and buying estates and so on back in Scotland. One of the things that I think is important about slavery and its connection with Scotland is that not only were we involved in the slave trade, but we were also involved in the movement to abolish slavery. Slavery tells us so much about ourselves, both in the past and now. It tells us that we have not always just been the victims of history. We've not always just been the oppressed, dominated by a more powerful southern neighbour, but that also, when the opportunity arose, we've often been equally good at oppressing other people.
Burns said whisky and freedom gang together. It's certainly true that Scotland and drink gang together, for better or worse.
The Scots do have a reputation for being heavy drinkers, but I think in some cases that's unjust. And yet, travellers, even in the 18th century, Dr. Johnson in the 1770s, remarked that although a lot was drunk, the Scots were not a drunken race. The pattern had changed somewhat by the mid-19th century, where there was a growth of very rough shebeens, unlicensed taverns and so on, and a great increase in drunkenness amongst the plain people.
Myself, since it's 12 and a I restless Scotland disease, 12 and a terrible. Och, it takes all your pleasure away.
The whiskey industry really evolved in the 1870s. The worldwide popularity of Scotch meant that it rapidly became Scotland's greatest ambassador. I think I'm right in saying it's the 5th largest export earner of all the things that the UK makes. Drink, alcohol, is such an important part of Scottish history and of Scottish life in the past and today that it really does deserve to be included.
Tartan isn't just for the tourists. It was worn in Scotland before the time of the Romans, and it remains a vibrant visual symbol of our nation.
is 21st century tartan. Tartan brought up to date. There you go.
Tartan is such a symbol of identity for Scotland all over the world, wherever you go. And people actually love tartan outside Scotland, sometimes more than they do inside. The suppression of tartan dates to 1746, the great defeat of Culloden, and it was part of the Disarming Act. Because the Highlander was identified by his tartan garb, anything that said this is the barbarous, warmongering Highlander was suppressed. When George IV visited Edinburgh, this was a splendid state occasion, and it was more or less staged managed by Sir Walter Scott. And it was Walter Scott who decided that the king should be dressed for the occasion in tartan. He didn't want to parody the Highland dress, but he actually wanted to have the King of Britain wearing the garb that his government had once banned. Tartan is such a cultural emblem, and regardless of its history even, it's internationally known as an emblem for Scotland and for this very small country that has such an amazing amount to be proud of, and tartan is symbolic of that.
In Scotland, our history goes back thousands of years, but it comes right up to the 21st century. Scots are proud not just of our ancient heroes, but also of the part our country has played in creating the modern world.
I think the most important thing to happen in Scottish history is TV.
The First World War created a radical shift in people's opinions of who they were and where they were.
Anaesthetic.
Go for the opening of the Scottish Parliament.
Scotland's great scientists include the geologist James Hutton, television pioneer John Logie Baird, and the inventor of radar, Robert Watson Watt. But Bruce Borthwick argues that the physicist James Clerk Maxwell was the greatest of them all.
Without the work of Clerk Maxwell, we would not have radio, we would not have television, we would not have radar, we would not have mobile phones. James Clerk Maxwell is one of the greatest mathematical physicist geniuses who has ever lived, the greatest intellect that Scotland has ever produced. Clerk Maxwell, in his work on electromagnetism, realised that the world was actually made up of energy fields and force fields. And I always have a little smile when, in the Star Wars films, someone makes the comment, "May the Force be with you." They don't realise that that goes right back to Clerk Maxwell. He did groundbreaking work with light and colour imagery, and by splitting light into green, red and blue, he could then reproduce any colour image, which he did 50 years before anyone else followed him. Clerk Maxwell is recognised by the cognoscenti of science as the third in the triumvirate of Isaac Newton, Clerk Maxwell and Albert Einstein. Radio, television, radar, mobile telephones all go back to 4 equations which he formulated that basically opened the universe to mankind. And Einstein was a huge fan. He said, with the work of James Clerk Maxwell, the whole world changed. And you can't be more important than that.
Scotland has a distinguished medical history. Edinburgh University trained Dr. Nazim Ghouri celebrates what he considers to be Scotland's greatest medical achievement.
If you ask me, the greatest achievement has to be Alexander Fleming and his discovery of penicillin. He was working on influenza virus when he noticed some mould growing on a bacteria culture plate. He then noticed that after some time there was an area where there was no bacteria, and this accidental discovery led to the development of penicillin. Penicillin can be seen as one of the cheapest and most widely used antibiotics throughout the world. Diseases due to infection are probably the leading cause of illness and death worldwide, and the majority of diseases are due to bacteria. And in many countries, to this day, penicillin remains the first-line drug to treat infections. For example, the deadly meningitis, penicillin is used as a first-line drug, and in that way, countless number of lives have been saved. Scotland, despite its size, has contributed greatly to one of the most intellectually challenging fields, from the development of educational institutions and training of doctors to the discovery and implementation of drugs and techniques. Scotland has led the world in many ways.
Tens of thousands of Scots lie buried in the battlefields of the First and Second World Wars, but it was World War I that was the pivotal event in Scotland's 20th century, according to historian and journalist Trevor Royal.
The First World War differed from the earlier conflicts because it was an industrialized war. For the first time, certainly in Europe, nations were able to use railways, high explosives, modern rifles, and of course the killing was on an industrialized scale too. The initial reaction to enlistment was very positive in Scotland. In fact, in 1914 and 1915 there was a higher level of recruitment per head of population in the 18 to 41 age group than in any other part of the country. And of course the thing about them was that they had great soldierly qualities. We can take the German High Command's word for it. They did not like facing Scottish soldiers, and indeed they called the kilted Scottish soldiers the ladies from hell. If, for example, a Bavarian machine gunner had opened up on a company of Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, you can be certain sure that the casualties would all come from one area of Inverness-shire, so a village in that particular area could suffer very high casualties. If we look at the casualties in the island of Lewis, for example, over 6,000 men went off to war, and the casualties there were over 1,100. That's 17% of the population. That is a big chunk for a small and very isolated community. Scotland was changed inexorably by the First World War because in the summer of 1914 there was a Home Rule Bill about to be debated in Parliament. There was every possibility that it was going to be passed. What happened next was that the war came along, the Home Rule Bill was forgotten, and in the aftermath of the First World War, the Liberals who'd been supporting the bill disappeared more or less from the political scene, and the incoming Labour Party had no interest in Home Rule, and neither for that matter did the Conservatives, who of course in Scotland are better known as the Unionists. But Scotland would have become a very different country indeed if there had been no First World War. Scotland would have moved towards Home Rule during the rest of the decade, and by 1920 could almost have been on its way to becoming an independent country.
It's said that when someone told Donald Dewar he was the father of the new Scottish Parliament, he pulled a face and said, "If I'm the father, Mrs. Thatcher must be the mother."
Margaret Thatcher is so important to Scottish history because she exerted a profound influence over the nature of Scottish society and on the campaign for Scottish devolution. During the 1980s, Scottish voting behaviour began to diverge significantly from English voting behaviour. In England, Thatcher was dominating politics, and the Conservatives were returned to government with landslide majorities. So the Scots felt that they were developing a different political culture, and they resented Thatcher's policies, such as her economic strategy, because they felt that they were being governed by an illegitimate government. And by 1990, 80% of Scots favour constitutional change. a great difficulty was that she did not understand Scotland as a country. Thatcher's policies were intended to be implemented on a UK-wide basis. That meant that what was good for one part of Britain was good for another. So she took very little account of Scotland's individual circumstances, and that applies to Wales and the circumstances of Northern England as well. But this created the perception that she was anti-Scottish. In reality, Thatcher misunderstood the concept of a dual Scottish and British identity. She couldn't fully comprehend the concept of Scottish unionism. Margaret Thatcher was an unwitting architect of the present-day Scottish Parliament.
In this programme, we've traced my country's story from William Wallace to, believe it or not, Margaret Thatcher. From the Wars of Independence to the new Scottish Parliament. 7 centuries of events that have shaped our proud nation. Scotland's essential history.